Hello students, this is Professor McDonald again. This will be Chapter 3. This will be a narrated PowerPoint slide presentation. I just want to try to highlight some of the information contained in the slides and perhaps add some additional information to help your understanding of the material. Next slide. Our objectives: to compare and contrast the sociological and psychological explanations of terrorist violence, examine several international terrorist movements and their sociological explanations and foundations, define relative deprivation and absolute deprivation theories and their impact on terrorism, explore and describe criminological explanations of terrorism, and describe how political violence may be a strategic choice by nation states. What that means is by nation states as well as individuals. On this slide, political violence is the fruit of injustice. When you look at political violence as the fruit of injustice, what they're talking about is several areas of discussion. Intergroup conflict and collective violence, which will be your sociological explanations. And what we're talking about here is our group-based phenomena, where individuals join groups, and normally what we find out, they join groups for psychological reasons, and we'll explain that a little bit later. But a lot of times when terrorism manifests itself in these type of groups, they're weaker groups, and terrorism is the way for them to get notoriety. Their behavior is not irrational. If it's goal-directed, in other words, if they have goals, specific goals, they're not irrational people just out there committing crimes or committing terrorist acts for no purpose or focus. And of course, ultimately, what they're engaged in is collective violence, where the individuals of the group bond together and engage in violent activity. And as long as it helps them accomplish the goal, then in their minds it's rational. Another aspect of this discussion would be structural theory. And when they're talking about structural theory, what we're talking about is social conditions or structures within a culture or a civilization or a country or whatever. And for example, government would be a structure. Bureaucracy would be a structure. The role of the police would be structural. And social conditions that affect access to freedom. These are things that are structural complaints many times that emerge from terrorist activities. And when you have weak structures, this encourages, in other words, if you have a weak government, you have weak police protection, you have no rule of law within a country. Think about Mexico. They seem to fit that bill. What ultimately happens is you encourage the potential for revolution and also crime as well. And we'll also, in additional slides, talk about rationality and terrorist violence, the psychological explanations of terrorism, and criminological explanations of terrorism. Again, this is the sociological. We're talking about group-based in this next slide. In a group conflict that leads to collective violence, I explained that already. And essentially, if a group feels it is disadvantaged and uses violence to accomplish its goals, then that would be a sociological explanation for why they engage in terrorism. And again, like I said before, a lot of time for weaker groups to get more notoriety, that was something that they would engage in based on their goal structure. Then you have, again, structural theory, which I've already explained. In particular, the structural theory can be impacted by the absence of government. If we look at the tribal areas in Pakistan, these are relatively ungoverned areas. In other words, the government has very little influence in those areas. These are tribal areas, and the tribes essentially rule those areas. And when you have an absence of government or structure, or we'll say a unified rule of law within a section of a country, then what happens is you have the chance for the emergence of collective violence or the emergence of terrorist groups and individuals. And that's one thing that we've seen in the tribal areas. of Pakistan, they have perennially been a location where terrorist organizations have safe haven. And there are other explanations. If you also look at a country like Somalia, there's basically no government there, and so these places are ripe for terrorist activity, the emergence of terrorist organizations, and also severe criminal acts. Another thing that we talk about is deprivation theory. We have two types: relative deprivation and absolute deprivation. And when we're talking about relative deprivation, what that means is feelings of a group, and even it can be an individual, that they feel like they're second-class citizens. They're not, you could have, I know England has had this problem where they've had several terrorist attacks by individuals of Pakistani and other nations. These are individuals whose parents perhaps immigrated to England, and they're second-generation English. But they feel like that they've been treated as second-class citizens, that they're never really going to be accepted as equals, and so this builds up a frustration within the individual, and many times within the group or individuals that group together, and that could be a predicate for collective violence by either individuals or group behavior. Absolute deprivation is where an individual or a segment of society is deprived of any of the necessities of survival by government or society. In other words, they're not even allowed to exist essentially within that society, and that would be absolute deprivation. I'm trying to think of, if you look at some of the problems they've had in Africa with genocide, places like Rwanda or places like the Sudan, you've had groups within those countries that have suffered from absolute deprivation, where essentially the government wants to either kill them or drive them out. Look at Germany with their treatment of the Jews during World War II. So anyway, those are two important theories. And again, these are theories. These are theories to explain why individuals and groups, when we talk about sociological, we're talking about groups, why group would pull together and engage in violence. Okay, that's what these are, again, theories that are posed as possible explanations for the behavior. Another example they give is the Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland, and of course when you look at Ireland, and I can relate to this because my grandparents were Irish, that's more of an ethno-nationalistic, I would say, a war over there that they fought for many, many years, where the Irish Catholics that were in Northern Ireland felt like they were treated like second-class citizens as compared to the Protestants. What happened in Ireland was, back in the 16th century, the King of England actually gave land to the Protestants in Ireland, and over time the Irish became more of second-class citizens within their own, what they thought was their own country. And so what you have was the emergence of terrorist groups like the Irish Republican Army, the Provisional IRA, that emerged out of this feeling of deprivation within their own country. You also see that with the Palestinians in Israel as well. Next slide. And here's just a chart. I'm not going to spend much time on this. With sociological, again, group-based explanations of terrorism, you have the group, the IRA. Their constituency is the Northern Irish Catholics. In other words, when you say constituency, those are the people that they consider that they're serving and that the support they expect to get from them. And the adversary there would be the British government, which supports, obviously, Northern Ireland, and the Ulster Protestants, and those are the Protestants that live in Northern Ireland. And there's a couple of other examples there as well. Next slide. Now, let's look at the psychological explanations of terrorism. Again, these are theories that are being posed as to explain why individuals engage in terrorist behavior or resort to extreme violence. We have individual level explanations. We have group level explanations. There's also can be psychological explanations for that. There's general explanations, and then there's one case that we'll talk about, which would be the Stockholm Syndrome. And again, terrorism becomes a choice from violent alternatives. And for the individual or for groups, it's that solidarity. The group, the resources of the group, the goals of the group can ultimately end up overcoming that sense of individual choice. And so the individual goes with the group. And through the use of violence, the weak become stronger. Always remember that when you're dealing with terrorism. And of course, the political violence they engage in, the targets are depersonalized, the terrorism is justified, and many times the symbolic labels are attached to the targets themselves. Next slide. And again, here's a slide of some general psychological explanations. Terrorism is a choice among violent life alternatives. In other words, if you live in the West Bank in Israel and you're a Palestinian, maybe it's because of the cycle of violence that you've lived in, then terrorism becomes a normal evolution for an individual. In fact, if you look at literature of terrorist activities in Israel that Palestinians are involved in, for example, suicide bombers, these people are praised. If a person goes up and detonates themselves and kills 5 or 6 Jews or Israeli soldiers or whatever, they become martyrs, and their pictures are shown on their websites. They're used. I mean, they become very glorified based on this behavior. And again, let's go back to our thing we talked about before about terrorism. It can be a matter of perspective. To the Palestinians, killing Jews is not violence. It's a revolutionary struggle that is just. Again, the need to maintain group solidarity, a method to achieve power for the oppressed or the second-class citizen. Also, a manner to gain self-esteem. I remember reviewing a case study on one of the attacks in England, where you had these were English citizens, but they were of Pakistani descent, and sometimes they come over into the country. They have no friends. Maybe they're going to school there or whatever, and they go to a mosque, and the next thing you know, they get radicalized, and they have maybe they felt like they were second-class citizens with no friends, no roots in a community that didn't really want them, and then they find through a group, maybe it's a group of radicals that have ultimately engaged in terrorist activity, they find that self-esteem that they were looking for by belonging. And again, terrorism always provides a means to justify political violence, and that's really what separates them, because innocent victims are legitimate targets, because they're part of the oppressor, the system that is oppressing them. On this slide, before I start talking about the criminological explanations of terrorism, I did want to mention from our book the Stockholm Syndrome, which is a very interesting theory. In August 1973, 3 women and a man were taken hostage by 2 bank robbers in Stockholm, Sweden. It was a botched robbery that led to a hostage crisis that lasted for 6 days. And ultimately what happened was the hostages started to sympathize with their captors. In fact, they actually started to turn against the authorities who were trying to rescue them, denounce the authorities, and then ultimately when the hostage situation was over, they refused to testify. They actually went out and raised money in their defense, and one of the victims actually became engaged to one of the captors. And so it's an interesting syndrome that was developed. Basically, and experts don't agree on this, but it's called the Stockholm Syndrome, which is more of a condition. And those that say that it can occur and has occurred in other situations argue that the syndrome sets in when a prisoner suffers a psychological shift from captive to sympathizer. In theory, the prisoner will try to keep his or her captor happy in order to, to stay alive. And what they talk about is how this shift can occur if the event goes on for 3 or 4 days. So again, this could be a psychological explanation. Let's say if a person gets captured by a terrorist group, and there's a famous one we'll talk about later in the semester about Patty Hearst, and how this Stockholm Syndrome can kick in, and next thing you know, somebody who's a captive all of a sudden starts identifying, supporting. If you can imagine, in this case it was robbers. What if that was a terrorist group? But anyway, it's an interesting. Another thing they talk about on page 51. I'm not going to go into it now, but make sure you read about the women as terrorists. Women play a very prevalent role in terrorist organizations. They talk about the Chechen Black Widows and some of the other women. And in my research with other organizations, the Tamil Tigers, the Shining Path, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and some of the research I've done. What we found is some of the modern era women who were central figures in some of these terrorist groups were some of the most devoted, most dedicated. In particular, they found that out with some of the some of the German terrorist groups back in the 70s and 80s, the Red Army faction. Their women were very, very dedicated to the cause. So women do play a very active role in terrorist organizations. Now when we look at the criminological explanations, let's take a quick look at some of them. Some of these you've heard before. You probably should have heard this when you took criminology. Differential association theory. What that applies to is social learning. If you grow up with crime, your father's a criminal, your mother's a criminal, and all your older brothers are criminal, and you live in that cycle of violence, well then through that differential association you too could become a criminal. It doesn't mean everybody that grows up in a bad family is going to be bad, but it's just one of the theories that are posed. Again, remember, not everybody deviates from normal behavior, but just imagine if you're an Israeli or a Palestinian, you grow up in that world of a cycle of violence, and somebody, there's been multiple people in your family that have been killed by either side, and perhaps if you're Palestinian, perhaps your father is heavily involved with Hamas, which is a state. The State Department is identified as a terrorist organization involved with Hamas, and your brothers are involved with the terror group, and your uncles are involved with that terror group. Well, there's a good chance. It's not 100%, but again, an explanation if you join would be the differential association theory. So it's kind of like you're judged by the company that you keep. The next one is anonymity strain theory, and essentially that's based on a lack of opportunity. Inequality can lead to crime and political violence. In other words, your life lives under constant strain because of the lack of opportunity for you. Maybe it's jobs, employment, the opportunity to go to school, get an education, get ahead, and inequality, and that kicks in, and that would be another explanation as to why a person would adopt a life of violence. Routine activity theory, and what they're talking about there is if there's a strong supply of motivated offenders, a strong supply of victims, and a lack of social guardians, in other words, police to keep the society civil and a rule of law enforced, then just the routine activity theory explains that individuals can evolve into lives of terrorist violence or criminal activity based on that theory. And radical criminology, what they're talking about is the crime is caused by society's let me say it again, inequalical, political, and socioeconomic makeup. The system is unfair, especially for the lower classes. So individuals and groups can emerge from this this type of a setting within a society and ultimately engage in terrorist violence. So again, these are theories, criminological explanations of why people could either be involved in crime and perhaps political violence or terrorism. Next slide. In this slide we'll talk about political violence as strategic choice. Making revolution, acts of political violence, lighting the fuse. Remember, an act of political will is an effort to force change. So when you look at revolutionaries, that is their whole focus. The acts that they take, the political acts that they take, if it includes political violence or terrorism, it's done to force change within the society or the nation, whatever you want to call it. It's a rational decision adopted from a revolutionary's perspective. And they, in doing this, they adopt specific tactics and methodologies to defeat an adversary. And selecting terrorism is a process based on the experiences of each group, and becomes a expected outcome of an evolutionary political progression. That's how it's looked at. Again, it's a tool, and remember, the ends always justifies the means in many of the revolutionaries' minds. So as a result, terrorism is simply a tool, an option that is selected by members of the political fringe. It's interesting, if you look at these photographs, you have Karl Marx to the left. Marx believed that the history and human social evolution were strong forces that would inevitably end in the triumph of the revolutionary working class, which he called the workers or the proletariat, would eventually rise up because they were the closest to the means of production and overthrow the capitalist system as it existed, and eventually the capitalism itself would collapse and would be replaced by a socialistic society, which he felt would be more fair-based with your distribution of wealth, etc. Now Lenin, who's the other individual, and he was the leader of the Russian Revolution, which led to the formation of the Soviet Union. He understood that capitalism's demise would not come about without a push from an organized and disciplined vanguard organization such as, in his case, as the Communist Party. So he didn't think that it would just eventually happen as Marx did. And ultimately, Marx actually made a mistake. He thought it would be the working class that would rise up. They did not. It was actually the peasantry, which was called the lumpen proletariat, that ultimately rose up. But Lenin realized that the peasants or whomever that you needed to support your revolution, they would have to have a little push to get them going. And in our textbook, in Mao Zedong, he saw this the same way, and he called it was a strategy known as the People's War, and we'll talk about that in another slide. So these are very interesting individuals who were involved. Obviously, Marx was the inspiration for communism, and Lenin was the leader of the Russian Revolution, him and a guy named Leon Trotsky. And there's a picture of Chairman Mao. When he looks at acts of political will, it's a rational strategic choice to force change. Terrorism is a tool. Mao Zedong, he called it the People's War. And his revolution was successful because in his mind, they would outlast their adversary. His war was drawn out over a long period of time. And the things that he instilled in his troops, and of course where his revolution started in the countryside, is to treat the people well, win the countryside, and then move to the cities. And more of a hit and run, guerrilla type warfare. That was the methods that were used in their struggle and their people's war, and ultimately they prevailed over the Chinese nationalists. And when they won, they drove Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Chinese nationalists, from the mainland in 1949, and they ultimately ended up on the island of Taiwan. And again, that was Mao's military political doctrine. All these things were interconnected, and of course terrorism was a part of that method. Again, the end justifies the means. And again, let's just talk a little bit about the prior slide. Again, the People's War, the Chinese Revolution, acts of strong will, political will. They felt that the Chinese communists felt that they had the ideological will and the high road in these battles. And of course, Mao Zedong had principles: indoctrinate the army as to our cause, win over the people, in particular the people in the countryside, hit and run, and fight forever. And so they fought for close to 15 years. They fought a guerrilla war with roving bands. Occasionally these bands would come together and consolidate, but the methods were the same. And in the People's War, assassination was legitimate, whether it be soldiers, bureaucrats, civilian collaborators in their mind. So that's where their terrorist activity occurred. Now, of course, if you ask them from a matter of perspective, that wasn't terrorism. But for people in civilized society, that's not the way to conduct a war. But in their revolution, they felt they had the ideological will. So again, political violence was a strategic choice to help the Chinese communists win the war. So let's look a little bit more at this slide. When we look at adversaries in the war on terrorism, there are different perceptions. From a Western perception, we see this as a war against our Western-style civilization, our freedoms, our liberties. From the non-Western perspective, especially in places like the Middle East and South Asia, they look at it as an imbalance in policies towards Muslim countries vis-a-vis Israel, our unending support of Israel. Therefore, in their perception, we always favor Israel over the Muslims or the Arabs or the Palestinians, if you're looking at that issue. Another interesting perception is the concept that the behavior of the West is the cause of angry sentiment. In other words, the way we carry out ourselves, whether it be economically, our successes, going into Muslim countries, our companies going in and taking part in drilling for oil or whatever. To many Muslims, they see that as a cultural clash and how the West has dominated the Muslim world. And believe it or not, this message does resonate. This is not something that's new. It's been going on for a long time. And of course, we again look at it as defending ourselves when we look at terrorist activities against barbarism, democracy, and freedoms. So perception is a big part of it. And if you look at your real strong-willed Islamic fundamentalists, they look at the war on terror as a war on the religion of Islam, which of course it is not, but that's their perception, and that's how they try to sell it to that fringe element that supports their activities. And then when you look around the world today, of course, and on the slide they talk about the CIA's 2007 National Intelligence Estimate. Because of the war in Iraq, it became a training ground for many of these terrorists to get experience. And now the Syria seems to be a ground zero or a training ground. Individuals that are with ISIS and some of the, or even Yemen with Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula and these organizations. And so you've got fighters, these Muslim mujahideen that are being smuggled into these countries where battles are going on, where they're getting a lot of experience. And as our book says, many of the young Muslims They like our Western culture. They like our clothes, our movies, etc. But at the same time, they respect their religion is very paramount in their world. Is very important in their world. Not that it isn't in our country, and what they try, what the fundamentalists try to get across is, if one Muslim is injured by a non-Muslim in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, it is the duties of all Muslims of the world to help him. So this is some of the rhetoric and some of the strategic decisions that are made, and we'll get into more of this as the semester goes along. And can we reconcile these? I mean, that's the important thing. Our book talks about that. What are the prospects for mitigating the source of terrorism in the modern era? Well, if you look at the statistics, terrorism is on the rise over the last several years. And some say it's because of the war in Iraq. That's only one element of it. Western troops in Muslim countries. 24-hour news, which is always broadcasting images of civilian casualties. And of course, in certain parts of the world, you have chronic violence, like between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the Russians and the Chechens. And these things feed into this this war on terror, this consistent threat environment that the world finds itself in. And again, the Mujahideen, they talk about in our book, many of the ones that came into Al-Qaeda in the early years, in the early 90s, were Islamic warriors who had fought in Afghanistan, or soldiers that had fought in Afghanistan against the Russians, and then they evolved into Al-Qaeda, and then many of them ended up fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now there's other parts of the world where this is happening. And that they get that group solidarity, some of the sociological explanations we've talked about in this narration already. Next slide. When you look at the morality, the moral convictions of terrorists, one of the things we've talked about this before, the simplified good and evil. Their cause is righteous, and the other side, the adversary, is evil, and they label these people, and it's the righteousness of the cause for both the individual and the group. Terrorism is a morally acceptable strategy, and terrorists look at this as that they have the moral high ground. Their principles are beyond reproach. Their methods are justifiable. The enemy is evil. We are victims, and there's some, and this is the same rhetoric that we've heard from leftists in Latin America back in the 70s and 80s against U.S. For our support of sometimes what they consider to be repressive regimes, our colonialism attitude, our economic penetration into these countries to, quote, steal their wealth, that sort of thing. And there's no compromise with some of the terrorist groups. Group belief is inherently morally superior. They talk about Kosovo, and the book is interesting explanation of moral convictions. And I had the privilege actually to go in there not as a soldier or a Marine, but as an agent shortly after the bombing there, when NATO went into the country and bombed. But this has been a battle going on for a long time, and I'll let you read about it in the textbook. But Kosovo itself had been a very considered to be a very sacred place to the Serb Empire many, many years ago. And the Serbs had a very strong bond with Kosovo that originated in 1389. They talk about it in the text when they lost a major battle. And when I was there, I heard them talk about it. And the Turks won that battle, and they controlled the country for the next 500 years. And during that time, Albanian Muslims started migrating into Kosovo and gradually displaced the Serb Christians. And approximately, in 1998, approximately 90% of the population, when I was there, 90% of the population was ethnic Albanian, and only 10% was Serb Christian. And ultimately what happened was the Milosevic, who was the head of Serbia at the time, his army moved in, took over Kosovo. Even though they were a minority, they controlled everything, the jobs, the educational facilities, etc. And that led to a formation of the Kosovo Liberation Army, and they went into a civil war essentially, which NATO eventually interceded on behalf of Kosovo, and in particular the ethnic Albanians, and the Serbs were driven from Kosovo. But the point being here, relative to moral conviction, from their perspective, the perspective of the Serbs, this was holy land to them in their culture and in their history, and they felt that the morality of their position was very clear. And that goes back to, sometimes 700-800 years ago. Incidents that occurred at that time. So, sometimes these problems are very, very complex. Seeking utopia, the only thing I'll have to say about that is that your simplified definitions of good and evil I've already talked about, and some of them feel like we're looking for the perfect society. They talk about nihilist dissidents, and nihilist dissidents, what they want to do is destroy the society as it exists. They're not concerned about what emerges from the ashes. Their job is to destroy it, and they just know that whatever emerges will be better than what it is now. And to do that, terrorism is justified. The ends justifies the means. And again, with the simplified good and evil, a clear line is drawn between good and evil. Violence is justified. In the seeking utopia, the promised good outweighs the present actions. The end justifies the means. There's a slide about codes of self-sacrifice, superior codes of living that cleanse those who follow the code. In other words, the superiority of that particular society or culture or whatever. Let's talk about society here. And the example we have here is the Germans would slaughter Allied prisoners. The German SS, they had a code that they lived by where they felt that they were superior. The Japanese, in particular, looked down on any individual that was captured as a prisoner of war. That was their culture. And so their code of Bushido, and in this photo they actually used live Chinese prisoners for bayonet practice. I mean, how brutal is that? And they were known for their brutalities, and that is their codes of self-sacrifice. But in particular, they looked down, the Japanese looked down on anybody that was a captive. They feel like that you should fight to the death, you should never surrender. And of course what happens is you end up with terrorist activities, or any way you want to put it, the brutal slaughtering of individuals. There's a good article about Layla Khalid and Abu Nidal, who were Palestinian terrorists, and so make sure you read about that. And there's a slide here on the Black Widows. I've mentioned that before. And the final slide, the morality of terrorist violence. Remember, we looked at the moral convictions of terrorists, the simplified definitions of good and evil, the seeking of utopia, and the codes of self-sacrifice that some adopted.